"You're a savage," her husband screams, aiming a gun at the mountain man. He's come to take her back to the town that banished her. But as he moves to grab her, Eliza steps in front. Her husband sees a detail in her eyes he doesn't recognize. She is no longer the broken woman he cast out, and the choice she makes next will seal all of their fates. The high desert wind was the only voice that hadn't judged her. It simply scoured the canyon walls, raw and honest, much like the whispers that had driven her from Durango. Eliza Hamilton pressed her forehead against the sun-baked granite, her body finally refusing to take another step. The word barren was a physical weight, a stone in her gut that had grown heavier with every mile she put between herself and the town that called itself civilized. Her fine town shoes were shredded, the soles worn through to the stockinged feet beneath, which were now just bloody rags against the scree. She had walked for 3 days, fueled only by a jug of water and a loaf of bread she hadn't deserved, a final, cold charity from the preacher's wife. Now the water was gone, the bread was a memory, and the shame was all that remained. She hadn't been exiled by a court of law. There was no trial for a broken womb. Her banishment had been delivered in polite nods, in averted gazes at the mercantile, in the sudden silence when she entered the sewing circle. It was finalized when her husband, a man of commerce and weak spine, had quietly posted the notice of dissolution, citing a failure to provide. He was recasting his own sterile seed as her divine punishment. The town of Durango, a place built on the promise of growth and legacy, had no use for a field that would not bear crops. She was an omen, a void, a reminder of failure. And so, with her head held high, until she was out of sight of the last church spire, she had walked east toward the Snakestone Mountains, mountains that promised nothing but an ending. Here, at the feet of the range, the silence was different. It wasn't the suffocating silence of judgment. It was the vast, indifferent quiet of eternity. A hawk circled overhead, a speck against the unforgiving blue, and it didn't care if her lineage ended with her. The rattlesnake that buzzed from beneath a juniper bush only cared that she was warm and moving. This land was cruel, but it was not unkind. It didn't whisper about her failings. It simply demanded survival. And that, Eliza realized, was a demand she could no longer meet. She slid down the rock face, her skirts tearing on the sharp edges, and came to rest in a heap of dust and regret. She closed her eyes, letting the crushing weight of the sun press the life from her. She was done. He had been watching her for the last hour. Silas had seen her stumble from the canyon mouth, a strange splash of faded calico against his world of gray rock and green pine. He was high above, checking a trap line, his form indistinguishable from the shadows of the cliff. He was a man made of mountain, all beard, leather, and silence. The folk in Durango, the few who ever ventured high enough to trade for his prime pelts, called him a ghost. They traded stories of him, a man more kin to the grizzlies than to them. Silas watched the woman collapse. He had seen this before. He had seen deer break a leg and lie down to wait for the wolves. He had seen civilization spit out its broken pieces, tossing them into his domain to be erased. He felt no pity. Pity was a town word. He felt only a grim acknowledgement. He waited. He watched as the sun beat down on her, as the hawk circled lower. She didn't move. She was giving up. This he understood. But as he watched, something else happened. A coyote, brazen in the afternoon heat, trotted from the brush. It sniffed the air, its eyes on the unmoving woman. It was testing her, waiting for the weakness to turn to stillness. The woman, Eliza, saw it. She didn't scream. She didn't scramble for a rock. She simply watched it, and gathered the strength to pull her legs beneath her, a small, futile gesture of defiance. She would not be eaten while she still breathed. Silas let out a low breath through his nose. It was not pity that moved him, but respect. A creature that refuses to be carrion deserved better. The coyote's ears flattened, and it vanished back into the scrub oaks, sensing a greater predator. Silas moved down the slope with a silence that defied his size. Eliza heard nothing, sensed nothing, until a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her vision blurring, into the sun. The shadow resolved itself into a man, or rather, the shape of a man. He was immense, wrapped in patched furs and hides, his beard a wild tangle of gray and black that merged with the hair on his head. His eyes were the color of the sky just before a snowstorm, and they held no judgment, no kindness, no malice. They simply were. He looked at her, then at her bloody feet, then at the empty horizon she had come from. He said nothing. Eliza found she had no voice to scream. This was it then, the mountain's final answer. He grunted, a sound like stone shifting, and bent down. His hands, calloused and scarred, were surprisingly gentle as he looped one massive arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a dried deer hide. Eliza was too weak to struggle. She closed her eyes, expecting the end. But the end did not come. Instead, she felt the rhythmic sway of his stride, the warmth of his body through the thick leather. She smelled pine smoke, cured meat, and the sharp, clean scent of the high altitude. When she dared to open her eyes again, the world was moving. He was carrying her up a narrow, hidden path, away from the desert floor and into the deep timber. He took her to a place the maps ignored. A solid cabin, built of massive logs, tucked into a fold of the mountain so perfectly it seemed to have grown there. A thin plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney. He pushed the heavy wooden door open with his shoulder and carried her inside, depositing her not on the dirt floor, but on a cot piled with soft rabbit and beaver furs. The cabin was one room, warm and dim. It smelled of wood smoke and herbs. A rifle rested on pegs above the cold hearth. He moved to the fireplace, added wood, and struck a flint. As the flames caught, casting flickering light, he turned back to her. He was still a terrifying figure, a man of the wilderness, but he had brought her into his home. He dipped a ladle into a pot near the fire and brought her a tin cup of warm, thin broth. Eliza took it in trembling hands. "You drink," he said. His voice was a low rasp, unused to conversation. "The mountain ain't done with you yet." Eliza drifted in and out of a haze for days. The broth turned to a thicker stew, rich with meat she couldn't name. He tended to her with a gruff, functional care. He would enter the cabin, his presence filling the space, and simply place a bowl of food and a cup of fresh cold water from the creek beside her cot. He never asked how she felt. He never offered words of comfort. His actions were his only language. He would clean the wounds on her feet with a pungent herbal wash that stung before it soothed, binding them in clean strips of linen. He would stoke the fire, then sit at a rough-hewn table, his massive hands busy mending a strap of leather or sharpening a knife. His silence, as thick and heavy as the furs on her bed. She learned the rhythm of him. He was gone before sunrise, the cabin already warm when she woke. He would return in the late afternoon, a brace of rabbits or a string of fish slung over his shoulder. He moved with a purpose that was both economical and deeply competent. Her strength returned slowly, but her spirit remained in that sun-scorched place at the mountain's foot. She was a ghost in his home, a silent observer. She watched him. She watched the way his eyes, the color of a winter sky, constantly scanned the ridgeline. Even when he was inside, he wasn't just looking, he was listening, sensing. He was a part of the mountain, and it spoke to him in a language she couldn't understand. The cabin was his fortress, a testament to a life lived entirely apart. There were no pictures, no letters, no delicate trinkets, only tools, traps, meticulously stacked firewood, and shelves of dried herbs and jerky. It was a life stripped bare of want, focused only on need. And yet, there was a strange order to it. His knives were always sharp, his furs clean, his floor swept. He was not a savage. He was a man of intense, solitary discipline. She began to move about the cabin, her feet now healing, the pain a dull throb. She would rise and fold the furs on her cot, straighten the few items on the shelves. It was a way to reclaim her own hands, to feel useful. He watched her tentative movements, his gaze unreadable. He neither encouraged nor forbade her. He simply allowed her presence. But his allowance felt conditional, a temporary reprieve. Why had he saved her? He was a man who lived by the harsh laws of nature. He would have known she was dying. He should have left her for the coyotes. The question burned in her, a new kind of pain. He was not a man one simply questioned. His silence was a wall, and she was afraid of what lay on the other side. The nights were the hardest. The wind howled around the eaves, a lonely, mournful sound that echoed the emptiness inside her. The fire would burn low, casting long, dancing shadows. Silas would sit in his chair, not sleeping, just watching the flames, his face a mask of stone and shadow. In those moments, he seemed utterly alone, more isolated than any man she had ever known. His solitude felt ancient, a deep, foundational part of him. She was an intrusion, a complication he had brought into his world for a reason she could not fathom. One night, the silence stretched too thin. The wail of the wind outside clawed at her, ripping open the fragile scab she had formed over her grief. She thought of Durango, of the pitying, judgmental eyes. She thought of her husband's cold dismissal. She thought of the doctor's clinical, final words. "The Lord's will, Mrs. Hamilton. You are barren." A sob, sharp and painful, tore from her throat. She muffled it against the fur pillow, but the sound was loud in the small cabin. Silas stiffened. His head turned slowly, his eyes finding her in the dimness. She saw not anger, but a still, quiet intensity. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited. His silence was no longer a wall. It was an invitation. It was a space waiting to be filled. And the truth, the poison she had carried for so long, spilled out of her. "They cast me out," she whispered, her voice raw. "My husband, the town, they threw me away." She sat up, the furs falling away, her hands twisting in her lap. "It's because I'm broken." Silas watched her, his expression unchanged. He gave her nothing, no nod of sympathy, no gesture of comfort. He just waited for the rest of it. His stillness demanded the whole truth. "I can't have children," she finally choked out. The words hung in the air, naked and ugly. "I'm barren, a field that won't grow, a woman with no purpose." This was her sentence, the crime for which she had been exiled. She looked at him, expecting the same look of pity or disgust she had seen in every other face. She expected him to finally understand his mistake, to see that he had saved something worthless. He had brought a broken, useless thing into his perfect, functional world. She waited for him to tell her to leave, to send her back to the desert that had nearly claimed her. Silas held her gaze for a long moment. The fire crackled, the only sound in the world. He rose from his chair, a mountain of a man, and for a second she flinched, thinking he might strike her or simply open the door and point out into the darkness. Instead, he walked to the hearth, picked up the iron poker, and slowly, deliberately, stoked the fire. The embers flared, casting a warm, bright light over the room. He did not look at her. He just tended the flames, his presence solid and unwavering. The silence stretched, but it had changed. Her confession, her shame, had been absorbed by the quiet of the cabin, by the stillness of this man, and had not destroyed them. He returned to his chair. He looked at her, his eyes clear. "The mountain don't care what you can't do," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It only cares what you do." He picked up his knife and a piece of wood and began to carve as if the conversation were over. But for Eliza, the world had just shifted on its axis. He knew her deepest shame, her greatest failure. and he had not cast her out. The next morning, Eliza awoke to a sliver of gray light. She had slept deeply, a sleep born of emotional exhaustion, and for a moment she thought the night before had been a dream. Then she saw Silas, already dressed, watching her from the hearth. He had not gone out. She expected a change, a coldness, the familiar sting of rejection now that her uselessness was confirmed. Instead, he jerked his head toward the door. "Get your coat." His voice was flat, a command. Fear fluttered in her chest. Was this it? Was he taking her back to the desert? He saw her hesitation and grunted, tossing a pair of oversized mended boots onto her cot. They were his. "Stuff them with grass," he said. "They'll hold. Move." She obeyed, her hands trembling as she pulled on the heavy boots and her thin coat. He opened the door, and the pre-dawn air was so cold it felt like a slap. He didn't lead her down the mountain path. He went behind the cabin, pushing through a curtain of pine boughs that concealed a narrow game trail she had never noticed. The path was steep, and she struggled, her breath pluming in the thin, icy air. He didn't slow for her, but he also didn't get so far ahead that she would lose him. His pace was a silent command. Keep up. After a 10-minute climb, they reached a small, hidden plateau. A clearing sheltered on three sides by towering rock and ancient pines. In the center, built low against the hillside like a badger's den, was a second, smaller cabin. It was more of a dugout, with a living roof of sod and a wisp of smoke trickling from a small stone chimney. As they approached, the crude plank door creaked open. A small face, smudged with soot and crowned with a thatch of wild blonde hair, peeked out. Then another, darker head appeared beside it. Then a third, a small girl, who couldn't have been more than 5. They were dressed in a patchwork of furs and homespun wool, their eyes wide and wary as fawns, but their wariness was not for him. When they saw Silas, they burst from the cabin, stumbling through the snow. See, you brought breakfast?" the eldest boy shouted, running to slam into Silas's legs. Eliza stopped dead, her hand flying to her mouth. The world tilted. Children. Here. In this impossible, high, lonely place. They were thin, but not starving. Wild, but not feral. They clung to Silas's legs, and he put his massive scarred hands on their heads, a gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness that it stole her breath. The children, 2 boys and a girl, suddenly noticed her. They fell silent, instantly vanishing behind Silas's greatcoat, peering out at this strange, soft woman. Silas looked at Eliza. His face was unreadable in the gray light, his beard frosted with ice. "Wagon train," he said, his voice a low rumble. "2 winters back, got lost in the pass. Found 'em in a drift, half dead. Their folks, the wolves, got 'em." He didn't need to say more. The story was etched in the children's watchful eyes. He had saved them, hidden them, and was raising them here, alone. He looked from the children back to Eliza, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were clenched at her waist, empty and trembling. "You told me your womb was barren," he whispered. The word, so intimate in the frozen air, felt like a physical blow. Mine too. He didn't touch his own body. He tapped his temple, then his chest, over his heart. A man can be barren too, of hope, of a reason to see the next snow. He then gestured with his chin toward the 3 small faces hiding behind him. "I've got plenty for both of us." Eliza's legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the snow, not from weakness, but from the crushing, impossible weight of his words. Plenty. He wasn't talking about pelts, or meat, or the gold that fools hunted for. He was talking about this, about life, about the 3 small souls he had hoarded against the wilderness. He was offering her the one thing she believed God had denied her. He was offering her a purpose. The smallest child, the little girl with eyes the color of acorns, took a hesitant step away from Silas. She crept toward Eliza, her curiosity overriding her fear. She stopped a few feet away, tilting her head. Eliza looked at this small, wild creature, this child of the mountain, and, her body shaking with silent sobs, she slowly, painfully, held out a hand. The small girl, Lyra, stared at Eliza's outstretched hand for a long moment before taking a single, bold step forward. She didn't take the hand. Instead, she reached out a grimy finger and poked Eliza's cheek, as if checking to see if she were real. Then she recoiled, giggling, and ran back to the safety of Silas's legs. The two boys, Cale and Finn, watched with suspicion. Eliza's heart, which had just shattered and reformed, ached with a terrifying newness. This was not the gentle, welcoming motherhood of her dreams. This was something else entirely. Silas grunted, pulling a sack from his shoulder. "They eat," he said, handing the sack not to Eliza, but to the eldest boy, Cale. "They need wood. They need mending. This is Lyra. That's Finn. He's Cale." He had given her a task, not a family. The dugout was a den, rank with the smell of unwashed bodies, old smoke, and drying hides. It was clear Silas provided, but he did not nurture. He kept them alive, but he did not keep them clean. Eliza, whose home in Durango had been a sanctuary of polished wood and lavender-scented linen, felt a wave of nausea, but beneath it, a stronger, sharper feeling: purpose. That first day, she did not try to be a mother. She tried to be useful. She saw the state of their clothes, a collection of stiff, poorly stitched hides, and her fingers itched. She found a rusty needle and sinew and set to work. But this was not the fine embroidery she was used to. The leather was tough, resistant, and her delicate stitches were laughably inadequate. Her hands, soft from a life of leisure, were clumsy and weak. Cale, a boy of perhaps 9 with his father's watchful eyes, sneered at her attempt. "See stitches better?" he said. A simple, brutal statement of fact. "Your hands are like fish bellies." He was right. Silas's stitches, which she had seen on his own coat, were wide, crude, and immensely strong. Hers were a fragile decoration. She felt the old shame rise, hot and familiar. Useless. Barren in hands as well as womb. That night, she tried a different approach. The little girl, Lyra, was coughing, a dry rattling sound in the small space. Eliza, remembering a song her own mother used to sing, began to hum, then softly sing a lullaby of the Ohio valleys. The effect was immediate, but not what she intended. Finn, the middle child, clapped his hands over his ears. Cale threw a piece of dried wood at her feet. "Stop that noise," he hissed. "It's ugly." Lyra didn't coo. She just stared, her dark eyes wide with confusion, as if Eliza were a strange bird squawking in their nest. The mountain had its own lullabies: the wind, the cry of the hawk, the silence of Silas. Her songs were an invasion. The next morning, Silas brought in a freshly snared rabbit and dropped it at her feet. "They need meat," he said. It was a test. In Durango, the butcher delivered meat neatly wrapped in paper. Here, the rabbit's eyes were still dark and glassy. Eliza looked at the creature, then at the knife Silas offered her. Her stomach turned. She couldn't. She shook her head, backing away, a hand to her mouth. Silas's expression didn't change. There was no disappointment, no anger. It was worse. It was expectation. He had expected her to fail. He sighed, a sound like wind over rock, picked up the rabbit, and with 3 swift, economical motions, skinned and gutted it. He tossed the pelt to Cale, who immediately began scraping it with a stone. "You eat. You work," Silas said, not looking at her. "There's no room for China dolls on this mountain." The sting of his words was worse than Cale's. He had saved her, but he did not respect her. He saw her as she was, weak, soft, a creature of a world that had no value here. The test she was failing wasn't one of motherhood. It was one of survival. The true crisis came 3 days later. Lyra's cough worsened. By nightfall, she was burning with fever, her small body trembling under the furs. Eliza panicked. This, she knew. This was illness. She felt the child's forehead, her heart seizing. She tried to remember what the doctor in Durango did: cool compresses, willow bark tea, but her hands were shaking. She looked to Silas, her eyes wide with terror. "She's sick. We have to do something." Silas, who had been watching the child with a stillness that looked like indifference, sprang into action. But it was not panic. It was pure, focused competence. "Feverfew," he grunted, grabbing a pouch from the wall. "Yarrow and pine resin." He didn't ask for her help. He barked orders. "Stoke the fire. Hot. Keep her covered. Get snow." Eliza fumbled, her movements jerky and inefficient. He meanwhile crushed herbs into a pungent poultice, his massive hands moving with a surgeon's precision. He smeared the dark paste onto a strip of linen and bound it to Lyra's chest. He brewed a tea that smelled of earth and bitterness, and patiently, drop by drop, forced it between the child's cracked lips. Eliza could only watch, a useless, trembling spectator. She was the woman, the one who was supposed to know these arts, and she knew nothing. He was the savage, the mountain man, and he was the healer. She sat all night, holding Lyra's hand, a task he finally permitted her. She watched him move, watched him tend the child, his terrifying form a bastion of comfort. She saw him not as a brute, but as a protector, a provider, a healer. She saw a competence that was so profound it was humbling. Everything she had learned in her life, how to set a table, how to manage a household, how to dress, how to speak politely, it was all ash. It meant nothing. She had to unlearn Durango. She had to learn the mountain. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Lyra's breathing eased, and she fell into a true, healing sleep. Silas sat back on his heels, his shoulders slumping with a fatigue he had not shown until the danger was past. Eliza looked at him, her voice a hoarse whisper. You knew exactly what to do." Cale, who had been watching from his corner, spoke into the quiet. "Si knows everything. He saved us. You just get in the way." The boy's hatred was a sharp, clean pain. "You'll leave." Cale said, his voice flat. "The last one did. He said the mountain was too hard, and Si was too mean." Eliza froze. The last one? There had been another? Another person Silas had tried to save, who had failed his test? She looked at Silas, but his face was a mask. "You will," Cale insisted. "You're weak. You can't even skin a rabbit." For the first time, Eliza didn't feel shame. She felt a spark, hot and bright, in her chest. It was anger, not at the boy, not even at Silas. It was anger at her own uselessness. She was tired of being weak. She got to her feet. She looked at the bloody pelt Cale had been working on. She looked at the herbs Silas had used. She looked at the fire she had so poorly stoked. She would not be a china doll. She would not be the one who fled. "Show me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Silas looked up, his eyes sharp. "Show me," she repeated, stronger. "Show me how to use the knife. Show me which herbs. I will not be in the way." Silas stared at her, the firelight catching the cold silver of his eyes. He held her gaze for a full minute, searching for the fragile spine he doubted was there. He had seen this before, a flicker of town-bred defiance, a spark that turned to ash at the first real hardship. He expected her to wilt, to drop her gaze, to dissolve into the tears she had held back. Eliza did not look away. The anger had burned away her fear, leaving a core of something hard and new. She would not break. She would not flee. She would be forged. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. "Tomorrow," he said. "Dawn, you slow me down, I leave you." Tomorrow came with a cold so bitter it felt like a physical weight. Silas was waiting by the door. He didn't offer her breakfast. He simply tossed a heavy pack at her feet. "Carry it." It was half his normal load, but to Eliza, it felt like she was carrying the mountain itself. He took her on his trapline. It was not a walk. It was a grueling assault. He moved with a relentless, ground-eating pace, forcing her to scramble over slick, ice-covered rocks and push through dense thickets that tore at her coat and skin. Her lungs burned, her legs felt like water, and the pack straps dug into her soft shoulders until they were raw. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. He just moved, a force of nature, and she followed, her entire world narrowing to the print of his moccasin in the snow. He stopped at the first trap. A simple snare. A rabbit, frozen stiff, hung in the wire. He cut it down and threw it to her. "Skin it." His voice was flat. Eliza's hands were numb, clumsy claws inside her wet mittens. She pulled them off, the air instantly biting at her skin. She fumbled with the knife he'd given her, the one she demanded to learn. The rabbit's body was a cold, unyielding weight. She tried to make the first cut as she had seen him do. The knife slipped on the frozen fur, skittering uselessly. Tears of sheer, painful frustration welled in her eyes, freezing on her lashes. She was failing. Again. Silas watched, his face impassive. He made no move to help. The hide is worthless if you cut it wrong. The meat spoils if you wait. The children don't eat if you fail. His words were not cruel. They were the simple, unvarnished truth of this place. There was no room for failure. Eliza took a ragged breath, the cold searing her lungs. She looked at her trembling, useless hands. She thought of Cale's sneer. "You're weak." She gripped the knife. She would not be weak. She forced her fingers to obey, using the last of her failing strength to make the cut. It was jagged, ugly, a butcher's hack compared to his clean line, but it was a start. It took her an agonizing 20 minutes. Her hands were blue with cold, streaked with blood that was not her own. When she was done, the pelt was a ruined, ragged mess, and the meat was hacked. But the rabbit was skinned. She held it up, a pathetic offering, her body shaking violently. Silas merely grunted. "You wasted the best part of the hide. Do it again." He tossed her another rabbit from his pack. And so it went. For weeks, he became her brutal, silent teacher. He taught her the language of the mountain, not with words, but with tasks. He would point to a plant. "This one," he'd say, crushing a leaf, "for fever." Then he'd point to its neighbor, a plant that looked almost identical. "This one, for death." He taught her to read the snow. This track was a fox, this a coyote. This was a deer. And this wide, deep print, with the faint claw marks, this was the cougar that was watching them even now. He taught her to be quiet, to move not through the forest, but with it. He taught her his stitches, forcing her to push the thick sinew needle through stiff, cold hide, until her fingers were bloody and raw. Not for pretty, he'd growl, pulling her weak stitch apart. For strong. Eliza absorbed it all. She fell, she bled, she wept in the cold, but she did not stop. She learned to bank the fire so it would hold a coal until morning. She learned to render fat and make pemmican. She learned to set a snare, and her heart nearly burst with a fierce, primal joy, the first time she caught her own meal. Cale watched her, his contempt slowly, almost imperceptibly, turning to a grudging curiosity. She no longer tried to sing to them. She no longer offered soft, useless comforts. Instead, she mended their clothes with strong, ugly stitches that held. She cooked the meat she herself had learned to skin. She was becoming useful. The turning point came not with a triumph, but with a near disaster. It was a day of false spring, the sun warm enough to melt the snow on the southern slopes, turning the world to a treacherous mix of mud and ice. Eliza was with the children in the clearing, tasked with watching them while Silas checked a high ridgeline. Cale, the eldest, was teaching Finn to use a small bow, while Lyra, her health fully returned, chased a snowshoe hare into the rocks near the edge of the plateau. Eliza was focused on her mending, her hands now calloused and competent, when a sharp, unnatural crack split the air. It wasn't a gunshot. It was rock. She looked up. Finn, trying to retrieve a lost arrow, had scrambled onto a precarious outcrop of shale. The thaw had made it unstable. As she watched, the rock under his feet gave way. The boy cried out, a thin, terrified sound, as he slid, disappearing over the edge. Eliza didn't think. She didn't scream for Silas. She moved. She was already running, her mind a sharp, clear instrument. She remembered the path. She remembered Silas's words. Never run on loose rock. Move low. 3 points of contact. She reached the edge. Finn hadn't fallen far. He was 10 feet down, clinging desperately to the root of a small pine, his feet dangling over a 30-foot drop to the creek bed below. He was crying, his knuckles white. "Don't move, Finn," she shouted, her voice sharp with a command she didn't know she possessed. Cale was frozen, his face pale with terror. "He's slipping," Cale yelled. Eliza scanned the ground. Her eyes landed on the snare line she now carried looped on her own belt. It was thin, but it was strong, woven for strength, Silas had taught her. She anchored herself against a solid pine, looping the rope twice, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that was not her own. It was his. She lowered the loop. "Finn, grab the rope. Put it under your arms." The boy was too scared. He just clung to the root, sobbing. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Eliza said, her voice dropping into a low, calm register, the one she'd heard Silas use. "You are the mountain son. You are strong. Now, do it." Finn, responding to the tone, not the words, fumbled with one hand, grabbing the rope. He managed to slip it over his head. Eliza hauled, her muscles straining. He was heavier than a rabbit. She couldn't lift him. "Cale," she screamed. "Don't just stand there. Help me. Pull." The boy, snapped from his paralysis, scrambled to her side. He grabbed the rope, and together, with Eliza's mind and Cale's young strength, they hauled the smaller boy, scraping and crying, back over the ledge to safety. Finn collapsed, sobbing, into Eliza's arms. She held him, her own body trembling violently, patting his back, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cale just stood there, breathing hard, looking at Eliza. His gaze was no longer contemptuous. It was wide, stunned, and for the first time, it held a flicker of something else: respect. When Silas returned at dusk, he found them in the dugout. Eliza was stitching a tear in Finn's coat. Cale was adding wood to the fire. Lyra was asleep. The air was calm. He looked at Finn's scraped hands and the new strong stitches on his coat. He looked at Cale, who refused to meet his eyes. Then he looked at Eliza. She met his gaze, not with fear or shame, but with the steady calm of a woman who had faced a test and had not been found wanting. "Finn fell," she said simply. "The shale by the creek is loose. Cale and I pulled him up." Silas looked at the rope, still coiled by the door, damp with snow. He looked at her hands, raw from the pull. He said nothing, but that night he placed a second, smaller chair near the hearth. And for the first time, he gestured for her to sit, not as a guest, but as an equal. The second chair by the fire changed everything. It was a small gesture, but on the mountain, small gestures were the only language. It meant she was no longer a burden. She was a fixture. The dugout, once a place of tense survival, became a home. Eliza's presence, which Cale had once called an ugly noise, became its rhythm. She did not usurp Silas's role. She wove hers around it, filling the spaces he left empty. He was the mountain providing strength, security, and the harsh lessons of survival. She became the valley providing warmth, softness, and the lessons of the heart. She found a tattered primer in the wreckage of the wagon train. miraculously preserved in a rotting leather satchel. Its pages were stiff with ice and mold, but the letters were still visible. She dried it carefully by the fire, smoothing the pages with her hands. That evening, by the light of a rendered fat lamp, she opened it. "This," she said, pointing to the first letter, "is A." The children, who had only ever learned the language of tracks and wind, stared at the black sigil as if it were magic. Kael, ever suspicious, scoffed. "Just a scratch. Means nothing." "It means apple," Eliza said softly, sketching the shape of the fruit beside it. "It's a way to tell a story long after your voice is gone." Silas, mending a snowshoe in the corner, paused. His hands, which could read the entire history of a winter storm in a broken branch, stilled. He was watching, listening. This was a new kind of trap, a new kind of trail, and he did not understand it. But he saw the look in Kael's eyes. The boy's contempt was warring with a burning curiosity. Lyra, the youngest, crept forward and put her small, grimy finger on the letter. "A pull," she whispered, butchering the word, but capturing its essence. A new world had just cracked open in their small, dark home. From that day, life settled into a new pattern. The mornings were for Silas's lessons, tracking, snares, reading the weather. The afternoons were for Eliza's. She taught them letters. She taught them numbers, scratching sums in the ash on the hearth. She taught them the songs her mother had sung, and this time, Kael did not tell her to stop. He listened, his head bent, pretending to be busy with a piece of wood, but his foot tapped in time. Lyra, her small body now healthy and round, became Eliza's shadow. She had abandoned her ragged furs for a dress Eliza had fashioned from a soft deer hide. She would sit beside Eliza, mimicking her, trying to thread a sinew needle, her small face a mask of concentration. She would bring Eliza presents: a perfectly round, white quartz stone, a jay's blue feather, a pine cone that looked like a tiny tree. They were the mountain's jewels, and she laid them at Eliza's feet like offerings. Finn, the boy she had pulled from the ledge, was utterly devoted. He followed her everywhere, his quiet presence a constant comfort. He seemed to understand her moods. When she looked tired, he would quietly fetch more wood for the fire. When she sat to rest, he would curl up at her feet like a loyal wolf pup, content just to be near the person who had saved him. Silas watched it all, his silence shifting from a wall of stone to a deep, quiet pool. He saw the changes. He saw the way Lyra's hair was now brushed and braided, the way Finn's constant nervous energy had calmed, the way Kael's sharp, angry edges were being smoothed away. He saw his children, the wild things he had kept alive, being tamed, and he found, to his shock, that it did not anger him. It brought him a strange, unfamiliar feeling. It was peace. Their own intimacy grew not in grand gestures, but in shared tasks. It was no longer his trapline and her fire. It was our woodpile, our winter stores. "The snow will be deep by the next moon," he said one evening, his voice a low rumble. "We'll need more meat. I'll hunt the high ridge. You and Kael will set the creek snares." It was the first time he had trusted her, trusted any of them, with such a vital task. It was a partnership. He began to share things, not just teach. He'd return from a hunt and, while skinning a deer, would tell them the story of the chase. He spoke of the wind's direction, the cunning of the old buck, the patience it took. He was sharing his world, his skill, not as a lesson, but as a man sharing his day with his family. One afternoon, he returned carrying a large, freshly cut log of aspen. He said nothing, just sat outside the dugout and began to carve. For days he worked. Eliza and the children watched as, with his long, sharp knife, he slowly, skillfully hollowed and shaped the wood. On the third day, he presented it to Lyra. It was a doll, simple and crude, with bits of charcoal for eyes and corn silk for hair, but he had wrapped it in a scrap of the softest rabbit fur. Lyra touched it as if it were a holy relic. She had never owned a thing that wasn't purely for survival. She looked at Silas, her eyes shining, and threw her arms around his waist, burying her face in his leather coat. Silas froze, his hands hovering awkwardly in the air, his body rigid. He had not been touched with such simple, uncomplicated affection in a decade. Slowly, his hand came to rest on her head. He met Eliza's eyes over the top of the child's, and in his gaze, she saw the walls of his fortress, the ones he had built of ice and grief, finally, irrevocably, begin to melt. That night, a blizzard descended, locking them all inside the main cabin, which they had adopted as the winter home. The wind screamed, a furious white monster trying to tear the cabin from the mountain. But inside, it was warm. The children were asleep, piled together in a nest of furs. Eliza sat on her stool, reading the primer by the firelight. Silas sat on his, sharpening his axe, the shing-shing-shing of the whetstone, a rhythmic counterpoint to the storm. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. "I never thought," Eliza said softly, not looking up from the page, "that I could feel this." Silas paused, his hands still. "Feel what?" "This." She just stored to the sleeping children, the warm fire, the sturdy walls. "Peace. I thought my life was over, that I was a void, a nothing." Silas set the axe down. He looked at the fire, his craggy face softened by the glow. "A barren field ain't nothing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's just a field, waiting for the right season, or waiting for the right seed." He wasn't talking about farming. Eliza looked at him, her heart aching. "Silas, do you think? Am I?" She couldn't say the word. Mother. She couldn't claim a title she hadn't earned by blood. Silas turned his head and met her gaze. His eyes, the color of the storm outside, were clear and deep. "Cale," he said, "used to watch the door every night, waiting for me, scared I wouldn't come back." He nodded toward the sleeping pile of children. "Now, he don't watch the door. He watches the fire, waiting for you to finish your work, waiting for the story." He picked up his axe and the whetstone. "That's what I think." He went back to his work. The storm howled. But inside, the fire was warm, the children were safe, and for the first time in her life, Eliza Hamilton knew exactly who she was. She was home. The deep snows of midwinter locked them in, turning the high mountain fold into a world of their own. It was a white, silent paradise. The dugout was no longer a den. It was a school, a home, a fortress of warmth. The mornings were for Silas's lessons in the white-blanketed forest, teaching Cale and Finn how to read the subtle language of winter, how a ptarmigan's track differed from a hare's, how the snap of a frozen branch could tell of a coming wind. The afternoons were for Eliza. The primer was now supplemented by stories she told from memory, tales of a world of cities and oceans, things the children could barely imagine. She taught them sums, using smooth creek stones. She taught them how to make their letters, and Cale, to his own astonishment, was beginning to read. Lyra's wildness had softened. She would now sit, not at Eliza's feet, but beside her, her head resting on Eliza's knee as she listened. This peace, so hard-won, felt as if it would last forever. But the mountain did not permit forever. It was Silas who sensed it first. He had been on the high ridge, checking a deadfall trap. He returned early, moving not with his usual ground-eating stride, but with the silent, tense grace of a hunting cougar. He said nothing when he entered the dugout. He just checked his rifle, replaced the cap, and took a second, smaller pistol from his winter stores, tucking it into his belt. Eliza's heart, now attuned to his silences, went cold. "Silas, what is it?" "Riders," he said, his voice a low vibration. "2 of 'em, coming up the old pack trail. They ain't trappers." He looked at Eliza, his gaze sharp and heavy. "They're from Durango." The word hit her like a physical blow. Durango. The world below. The world that had spat her out. How do you know? Town boots? He said, as if that explained everything. And shod horses. No man of the mountain shoes his horse for this ice. They'll be here by afternoon. Panic, cold and familiar, seized her. They had found her. They had come to drag her back, to put her on display, the runaway barren wife. We have to hide, she said, her voice trembling, her eyes darting to the children. We can take them to the high pass. No, Silas said. He placed his rifle by the door. This is our home. We don't run. He looked at her, and his eyes were not the eyes of the gentle carver or the patient healer. They were the eyes of the man who had survived alone, the ghost of the snake stones. You, he said, his voice flat. Stay inside. Keep the children quiet. No fire, no smoke. They come, they find me, they don't find you. He was offering to be the wall, to stand between his new family and the world that had come to reclaim its broken peace. But Eliza looked at the sleeping children, at the strong, ugly stitches on Cale's mended coat, at the small aspen doll clutched in Lyra's hand. The old fear was still there, a cold snake in her belly. But something else was there too, a new, hot anger. This was her home. These were her children. Before she could answer, a voice, slick and dreadfully familiar, cut through the frozen air. Eliza? Eliza, my dear? Your game of hide-and-seek is over. It is unbecoming. Harrison Hamilton, her husband. He stood at the edge of the clearing, flanked by two men in long dusters, their hands resting on the holsters at their hips. Harrison looked smaller here, diminished by the scale of the mountains, his fine wool suit and city hat absurd against the backdrop of snow and granite. He saw her in the doorway, and his face, a mask of strained civility, twisted in disgust. My God, he breathed, his gaze raking over the dugout, the strung-up pelts, and finally Silas, who had moved to stand in front of the door. What has this brute done to you? You look like a savage. We are going home now. This is my home, Eliza said. Her voice was steady, and the sound of it seemed to shock them both. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Eliza, you are unwell. Your shame has addled your mind. These men are here to escort you back to civilization. We'll find a doctor for you. He then saw Cale, peeking from behind Eliza's skirts. Harrison's disgust curdled into righteous horror. And children? He's kidnapped children? This is worse than I thought. You men? He said to his hired guns. The woman is clearly a captive. These children must be taken to the orphanage in Denver. They must be civilized. They are not orphans. Eliza said, stepping out from the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides. They are ours. The lie, or perhaps the truth, came out before she could stop it. Harrison laughed, a short, ugly sound. Ours, my dear, you are barren. Remember? That is the one thing we know for certain. Now, you will step aside. He moved to grab her arm the same way he had for years, a gesture of ownership. And you? He sneered at Silas. You will release my wife, or these men will put a bullet in you and every other savage thing in this hole. Silas had not moved. He had not spoken. He had simply watched, his body a mountain of silent menace. But when Harrison's hand touched Eliza's arm, he reacted. He didn't draw his knife. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply moved his hand, his massive, scarred hand, and closed it around Harrison's wrist. He did not squeeze. He just held. Harrison's face went white. The bones in his wrist grated. He gasped, his arrogance collapsing into sudden, sharp pain. Let go of me! Kill him! He shrieked to his men. The two regulators drew their pistols. Let him go, mountain man. The first one said, his voice bored, or the lady gets it. The second man had his pistol aimed not at Silas, but squarely at Eliza. This was the moment. The old Eliza would have fainted or pled, or dissolved into tears, bargaining for a life she didn't even want. The new Eliza, the one forged by ice and hunger and a child's fever, looked at the man pointing a gun at her. She looked at her husband, pathetic and trembling in Silas's grip. She looked at Silas, a predator coiled and ready to strike, willing to die for her, for them. She stepped back, breaking Harrison's grip as Silas released him. She stood shoulder to shoulder with the mountain man. "No," she said. Her voice was not a plea. It was a command, as cold and sharp as the wind from the pass. "You were right, Harrison," she said, her voice clear in the frozen air. "I was barren, a field that wouldn't grow. You cast me out, you left me for dead, and in this place, I found a home." She put her hand on Silas's arm. "You come here with your laws and your money and your shame. But your world has no power here. This is our home. These are our children. This is my family." Harrison stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. This was not his weak, submissive wife. This was a stranger, a creature as wild as the man beside her. "You've gone mad," he whispered. "You're an animal. Then you are in the wrong den," Silas rumbled his first words. His hand had not left the hilt of his long knife. "Leave. Now!" Harrison scrambled back, rubbing his wrist. "You think you've won? You, a savage, and you, a broken whore? I will have the law on you. I will bring this whole mountain down on you." He turned to his men. "Grab her, grab the children. If the savage interferes, kill him." The two men looked at Harrison, then at Silas. Silas was one man. They were two, with guns. They fanned out, their pistols raised. The air crackled. This was it, the standoff, the end of their world. But as the men advanced, Eliza did something they never expected. She didn't hide behind Silas. She stepped in front of him. "The first man who takes a step toward that door," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she had never known she possessed, "will not leave this mountain alive. Silas is not the only one who knows how to survive here." The two hired guns hesitated, their eyes shifting. This was not the simple retrieval they'd been paid for. They had expected a frightened woman, a lumbering savage, and a quick payday. They had not expected this iron-eyed woman who stood before the giant, nor the look of cold, capable menace in the giant's eyes. Harrison, seeing their hesitation, flew into a rage. "What are you waiting for? She's mad! Shoot the brute! Shoot him!" The first regulator made his choice. He raised his pistol, aiming not at the woman, but at the larger, more obvious threat. The shot cracked, the sound impossibly loud, echoing flatly in the snow-dampened air. Silas moved, but not in the way Eliza expected. He didn't lunge. He didn't draw his knife. He simply turned, pulling Eliza behind him, shielding her body with his own as he shoved her toward the dugout door. The bullet slammed into his shoulder. A heavy, wet thud. He roared, a sound of pure animal rage, and stumbled to one knee. "Inside!" he bellowed, his voice thick with pain. "Get them safe, Eliza, go!" But the woman who would have run was gone. The woman who had been defined by fear was dead, buried in the desert dust at the mountain's foot. Eliza looked at the blood blooming dark on the leather of Silas's coat. She saw the first regulator advancing, his pistol smoking, readying for a second shot. She saw Harrison, his face alive with a vile, triumphant pleasure, and a cold, clear rage, the rage of a mother protecting her young, washed through her. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She moved. She spun back into the dugout, but not to the children. Her hand, now calloused and strong, wrapped around the handle of the heavy, cast-iron skillet she had been using to melt snow for water. The first regulator burst through the doorway, his eyes wide, ready to clear the den. He never saw her. Eliza swung the skillet with all the strength of the wood she had chopped, the animals she had skinned, the life she had fought for. The iron met his temple with a sickening crack. He dropped like a felled tree, his pistol clattering on the packed earth. The second man, stunned, shoved past Harrison and raised his own gun, leveling it at Eliza. "Bitch!" he screamed. But from the shadows of the dugout, a small, hard object flew through the air. Cale, who had been hiding with the others, had grabbed the first thing he could, the solid aspen doll Silas had carved for Lyra. He threw it with all his young, desperate might. The doll struck the regulator's wrist. The gun fired, the shot going wild, exploding a water cask against the far wall. The man cursed, shaking his tingling hand. But it was too late. The moment's hesitation was all Silas needed. Wounded, bleeding, but fueled by a primal fury, he lunged from the ground like a wounded bear. He ignored his injured shoulder, his left arm slamming into the regulator, pinning him against the doorframe. The man's gun clattered to the floor. Before he could even cry out, Silas's long, skinning knife was free. Its blade pressed hard under the man's chin. The fight was over. It had lasted less than 10 seconds. Silence, heavy and absolute, filled the dugout. Harrison stood frozen in the snow outside, his mouth open, his triumphant sneer now a mask of abject terror. His 2 paid men were down. The savage was wounded but alive. And his wife? His barren, broken wife. It was standing over a fallen man, holding a skillet like a weapon, her face streaked with soot and fury. Silas, breathing heavily, his knife unwavering, looked past the man he held and at Harrison. "Yours," he growled. The regulator at his mercy was nothing. The true enemy was the one who had brought the world's poison to his mountain. Silas shoved the terrified man away and stalked out the door, his bloody knife in his good hand. He crossed the small clearing in 2 strides and stood before Harrison. Harrison Hamilton, the man of commerce and standing, crumpled. He fell to his knees in the snow, his hands raised. "Please, don't. I'll give you anything. Money. I'll sign the divorce. You can have her. Just, please." Silas looked down at the pathetic, babbling man. He felt nothing but a cold disgust. He looked back at Eliza, who had followed him out. She was standing on the threshold, the skillet still in her hand. Her chest was heaving. This was her fight. This was her ghost. He had simply held the door. Eliza looked at the man who had named her a failure, who had cast her out, who had come to destroy the only home she had ever truly known. She felt the rage inside her, a white-hot, cleansing fire. But as she looked at him, sniveling in the snow, the fire died, leaving only a cold, gray ash. He was nothing. A weak, hollow man, made small by the towering pines and the silent, judging mountains. "Go," she said, her voice quiet. Harrison looked up, confused. "Go," she repeated, her voice stronger. "Take your broken men and go back to your town of whispers. You have no world here. You have no wife here." She let the heavy skillet fall from her hand, thudding into the snow. "You have nothing." Silas grabbed Harrison by the collar of his fine wool coat and hauled him to his feet, shoving him toward the trail. "And if you ever," Silas rumbled, his voice a promise of pure violence, "bring your world to my mountain again, I will not let you leave." Harrison stumbled, falling and scrambling to his feet. The first regulator was groaning, dragging himself out of the dugout. The second, his wrist broken, was already helping him. Like whipped dogs, the 3 men from Durango began their long, defeated retreat down the mountain. Eliza didn't watch them go. She turned to Silas. The rage was gone, replaced by a sharp, piercing fear. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his face pale, his arm slick with blood. "Silas," she breathed. Cale, Finn, and Lyra crept out, their small faces pale, but their eyes were not on the retreating men. They were on Silas. Eliza rushed to him, grabbing a clean linen rag from her pack, tearing it with her teeth. She pressed it hard against the wound. "Inside," she commanded. "Now." Cale, stoke that fire. Finn, bring me the herb wash. Lyra, hold the light. The children, not crying, not panicking, obeyed instantly. They were a team. They were his children. Silas grunted in pain as she eased him into the chair, the one he had given her. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but clear with a fierce, burning pride. Told you, he whispered, his hand coming up, his bloody fingers leaving a streak on her cheek as he touched her face. You ain't weak. He looked at the children moving with purpose around them. You ain't barren. Eliza held his hand, pressing it to her face, her tears finally coming, hot and fast, washing away the blood. No, she whispered, her voice thick. I'm not. She wasn't a void. She was a fortress. She wasn't a field that wouldn't grow. She was the mountain. She was the valley. She was a mother. The bullet had torn through the thick muscle of Silas's shoulder, a deep, ragged wound that bled profusely. Getting him from the dugout to the main cabin was a feat of sheer will. Eliza, her body thrumming with an adrenaline she had never known, half dragged, half carried him through the snow. Cale, on his other side, a small, grim-faced man, pushing with all his might. They got him onto his own cot, the one he had surrendered to her weeks ago. The battle was over, but the war for his life was just beginning. Eliza's mind was a shard of ice, all fear burned away, leaving only a cold, clear purpose. She was no longer the fumbling China doll. She was the woman who had learned from the mountain. Kyle, she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. Bar the door, and keep the rifle. Watch the clearing. If they come back, you yell. Finn, I need the yarrow, all of it, and the strongest sinew needle. Lyra, melt snow. As much as you can. Keep the kettle hot. The children scattered, their movements sure and practiced. They were a unit. Silas grunted, his face pale and slick with sweat, as she cut away his leather coat. The wound was ugly, but she did not flinch. This was just another rabbit, she told herself. Another deer. Just meat and blood and hide that needed mending. She washed it, her hands steady. She packed it with the yarrow paste, her touch firm. The hardest part was the needle. The skin was thick, tough as the hides he had forced her to sew. He hissed in pain as she pushed the needle through, but he did not cry out. He just watched her, his eyes dark with pain, but also with something else, a raw, stunned awe. She was saving him. She, the soft, useless woman from Durango, was stitching him back together. It took her an hour. Her hands ached, her back screamed, but she did not stop until the last strong, ugly stitch was pulled tight. She bound the wound, her movements economical, her mind silent. When she was done, she collapsed onto the stool, the bloody needle still clutched in her hand. Silas was pale, his breathing shallow, but the bleeding had stopped. He was alive. The children crept closer, their small faces a mixture of fear and wonder. Eliza looked at them, then back at the man on the cot. She had fought for this. This was hers. Spring came late, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet of their recovery. Silas's wound healed, leaving a puckered, angry scar that he would carry forever. But as his body mended, something else healed, too. The cold, silent fortress he had built around his heart had been breached, not by Harrison's bullets, but by Eliza's skillet, by Cale's courage, by the fierce, protective love she had shown. The dugout was abandoned, its small space now holding only memories of their first, harsh lessons. They were a family, and they lived as one in the main cabin. The change was profound. Laughter, a sound Silas had not heard in a decade, now echoed off the timber walls. Lyra, it turned out, had a laugh like a bubbling creek. Finn had a quiet, thoughtful smile that lit his face. And even Kyle, now Eliza's most devoted student and Silas's shadow, would let out a sharp bark of a laugh when Silas showed him a particularly clever trap. Eliza's world, once measured by teacups and polite conversation, was now measured by the height of the garden she had planted, by the number of pelts stretched for trade, by the steady cadence of Cale learning to read from the battered primer. Cale was a sponge. He devoured the letters, his sharp mind finally given a tool as keen as itself. He would sit for hours, his lips moving, as he painstakingly deciphered the stories of a world he'd never seen. But his hands were Silas's. He was learning to track, to hunt, to be the mountain's son, and he moved with a quiet, deadly grace that made Silas's chest ache with a terrible, beautiful pride. Finn, the boy she had pulled from the ledge, became her apprentice. He had a gift for the herbs, a gentle hand, a quiet, watchful nature. He was the healer, the one who tended the garden, the one who knew when Lyra was sad or Silas was tired. And Lyra was the wild heart of their family. She was a perfect, impossible fusion of both worlds, as comfortable setting a tiny snare with Silas as she was sitting in Eliza's lap, demanding a story. She was fearless, climbing the rocks Eliza forbade, her hair a wild tangle, her aspen, always tucked in her belt. One evening, as the long summer twilight painted the peaks in shades of purple and rose, Eliza and Silas sat on the bench outside the cabin, watching the children play a loud, scrambling game of tag near the creek. The air was warm, scented with pine and the rich, dark smell of the earth from Eliza's garden. "They're good," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "They are," Eliza said, leaning her head against his good shoulder. The scar was there, a hard ridge of flesh beneath his shirt. She touched it, a familiar, reverent gesture. "Cale is reading the primer by himself now. He says he wants to read the words in your books." Silas had a small, hidden chest, which Eliza had never opened. It held the few things he'd kept from his other life, a life he never spoke of. He had lost his own wife, his own child, to a fever in a settlement far to the east. It was a grief he had carried, a barrenness of the soul that had driven him to this high, lonely place. He had come here to die, just as she had. And here, they had both found these children, or perhaps, the children had found them. "My wife," Silas said, his voice rough. Eliza stiffened. He had never spoken her name. Her name was Anna. She liked the words. "She was the one who taught me my letters." He was quiet for a long moment. "She would have liked you. She would have liked this." He gestured to the children. His hand, no longer just a callous tool, but the hand of a father, resting on Eliza's. "I thought," Eliza whispered, her voice thick, "that my life was a punishment, that God had made me empty because I was worthless." She looked at the man beside her, this savage, this ghost, this healer, this husband. "You saved me, Silas. Not from the desert. You saved me from that." He turned his head, his beard brushing her hair. His winter sky eyes were no longer cold. They were clear and deep and filled with a love so profound it needed no words. "You," he said, his voice breaking on the single word. "You saved me." He hadn't just been barren of hope. He had been barren of touch, of laughter, of a reason to stoke the fire. She hadn't just brought her songs and her letters. She had brought life. She had taken his den and made it a home. She had taken his wild, grieving heart and made it a hearth. Cale shouted in triumph as he finally tagged Lyra. Finn laughed, a rare, bright sound. Lyra, outraged, shrieked and launched herself at Cale's back, and the two tumbled into the grass, a tangle of limbs and laughter. Silas looked at Eliza. "My Anna." She couldn't have children. The confession, mirroring her own, hung in the warm evening air. We were on our way to Oregon, to adopt an orphan. From a church, then the fever. He didn't need to finish. Eliza's heart broke and healed all at once. His grief was her grief. His emptiness, her own. "I can't have kids," she had confessed to him in the darkness, her voice full of shame. "I've got plenty for both of us," he had answered. She understood now. The plenty wasn't just the children he had saved. It was the vast, untapped well of love he had been carrying, a love that had nowhere to go. It was the home he had built, the knowledge he had gathered. He had an abundance of everything that mattered. Harrison, with his money and his laws and his town, was the truly barren one. Silas put his arm around her, pulling her close. His hand, scarred and strong, rested on her stomach, a gesture of possession, of partnership. "Our family," he said. Eliza closed her eyes, leaning into his strength, breathing in the scent of pine and smoke. She was not a failure. She was not a void. She was Eliza Hamilton, a woman of the Snakestone Mountains. She was a reader of stories, a healer, a protector. And as she sat there, her heart full, listening to the sound of her children laughing in the twilight, she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she was the most abundant woman in the world. 8 summers had passed. The mountain, once an adversary, was now a provider, a fortress, and a cradle. The cabin Silas had built was no longer a solitary outpost, but the heart of a homestead. A new room extended from the side, its windows catching the morning light. It was a schoolroom, a workshop, and a nursery all in one. The scar on Silas's shoulder was a silvery mark, a reminder of the day their family was truly forged. His beard was more gray than black, and the harsh lines around his eyes had softened, worn smooth not by wind, but by laughter. Eliza stood in her garden, a space she had carved from the rocky soil with her own hands. It was a riot of life: beans, squash, potatoes, and a large fragrant patch of the herbs Finn now knew better than she did. Her hands, stained with earth and calloused from the hoe, were no longer the pale, useless things of Durango. They were the hands of a woman who provided, who healed, who built. She watched as Finn, now 14, moved gently among the plants. He was a quiet, thoughtful boy, with his mother's long-lost gentleness and Silas's deep, watchful eyes. He was their healer, his knowledge of the mountain's remedies already surpassing Silas's. A sharp, clear laugh echoed from the high trail. Lyra, now 13, burst from the trees, her long hair braided and flying. She was a perfect, impossible creature, all wild grace and bright joy, her bare feet as tough as moccasin leather. She carried a string of rabbits, and she ran to show Finn her aspen doll, Aspen, tucked securely in the belt of her deer-hide tunic. Behind her, moving with his familiar silent stride, was Silas. He was carrying a rifle, but his other hand held a small bunch of wild blue columbine. He didn't look at Lyra's rabbits. He walked straight to Eliza in the garden and quietly handed her the flowers. It was a ritual of his, a daily offering, his own silent poetry. The cabin door opened, and Cale emerged, blinking in the bright sun. At 17, he was a man. He was tall, lean, and moved with his father's lethal quiet. But in his hand, he carried a worn copy of Shakespeare, a treasure brought by a trader 2 seasons ago. He was the mountain's son, a hunter who could track a cougar for 2 days, but he was also Eliza's scholar, a reader who craved the world beyond the peaks. He saw Eliza watching and raised the book. "He's a fool, this Othello," he said, his voice the same low rumble as Silas's. "He trusts words, not what he sees." "There's a lesson in that, then," Eliza said, her heart so full it ached. This was her world. This was the abundance she had been promised. A sound from the valley trail, the jingle of a harness, broke the afternoon peace. It was Harker, the trader who now made the yearly trip, bringing salt, flour, and news. He no longer feared Silas. He respected him and was in awe of Eliza. He reined in his mule, his eyes wide. Mrs. Hamilton, he said, sweeping off his hat. Your garden. It's a miracle. It gets bigger every year. And the children, there. He looked at Cale, who stood like a young king, at Finn's intelligent, calm gaze, at Lyra's bright, fierce health. They're thriving. He took a small pouch from his satchel. News from below, though it's old news to you, I reckon. He handed her a yellowed clipping from a Denver newspaper. Your husband, Mrs. Hamilton. Harrison. He passed. 2 years back. Eliza took the paper. She had felt no lingering tie, no anger, no grief. He was a ghost from a life that wasn't hers. He died in debt, Harker said, his voice soft. Lost his business. Died alone, they say. No heir. He looked at Eliza, at the children who were so clearly hers, at the powerful man who stood by her side. He died barren, ma'am, in every way that counts. Eliza looked at the clipping, at the name of the man who had called her a failure. She felt a brief, cold flicker of pity. Nothing more. She folded the paper and handed it back. The world below has its own tragedies, Mr. Harker, but they are not ours. That night, the family gathered around the long, heavy table that Silas and Cale had built together. The cabin was filled with the smell of rabbit stew, of the corn from her garden, and the warm, human scent of a family. The fire crackled in the hearth, the one she had once been afraid to stoke. Lyra, her head on Silas's good shoulder, was chattering about the fox she had seen. Finn was quietly explaining to Cale how a poultice could draw poison. Eliza looked at them, at this impossible, beautiful life she had built from the ashes of her old one. She thought of Harrison, dying alone in a dusty room, his legacy, a column of debt and a forgotten name. She looked at her hands, resting on the worn wood of the table hands that had stitched wounds, held children through fevers, hauled stone, and planted seeds. They were not empty, they were full. Silas, as if sensing her thoughts, reached across the table. His large, scarred hand, the one that had taught her to be strong, covered hers. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His touch said everything. He looked at her, his winter sky eyes no longer cold but warm, deep, and full of a quiet, unshakable love. Outside, the wind began to howl, the long, lonely voice of the mountain. But it was not a sound of desolation. It was not a threat. It was their song. It was the lullaby of their home. Eliza looked at the man who had saved her, and at the children who had given her a purpose. She was not a field that wouldn't grow. She was a forest, deep and wild and teeming with life. And she was, finally and completely, abundant. We hope this story from the high peaks found a warm place in your heart. Eliza and Silas's journey reminds us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build with our own hands, the one we are willing to fight for. If you believe that even the most barren life can find abundance, help us share these stories by leaving a like. And so you never miss another tale from the wilderness, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We'd love to read your thoughts below. What does